Hello, Chris.
Ah, Yolanda,
Nice to see you.
nice to see you too.
Yeah,
How are you doing there?
I'm well, but incredibly busy. It's the beginning of our semester, but I thought it was important to engage in my old alma mater. In my old college. You're
webinar on reinvigorating multilateralism amidst and also post the COVID-19 pandemic. I think this is a very timely webinar. We have a panel of distinguished academicians and also experienced diplomats to engage with this matter. Basically, in terms of background, or at least the motivations for this webinar, uh, we have seen that with the COVID-19 pandemic, there's a sense in which we have been given a wake-up call to multilateralism. We saw that when in the immediate aftermath of the breakout of the pandemic, many countries closed their borders. Uh, in Africa here, it was actually very significant, or at least it was very, very evident, because this is the year that with the COVID-19 to launch continental free trade area. They had planned to do it on 1st July, but then because of the pandemic, they've postponed it to next year, 2021. So, and mainly the reason was that they could not permit the movement of people, and also it just doesn't go well, the efforts to control the pandemic. So that speaks to its effect on issues of multilateralism. There are a lot of countries on the continent that have landlocked borders, and you will see that even transportation of goods through trucks has been slowed down. A lot of trucks are marooned at borders, and because of this same pandemic. So these are just some of the what you would call maybe negative consequences of the pandemic. But it just shows you also, on the other hand, that these engagements between countries are very important, and those are some of the things that maybe we might have taken for granted, especially if we are not academicians that are interested in those issues. But we bring together a panel of distinguished scholars to engage with these issues. But another one also maybe that I should just quickly point out, especially besides the issue of trade. Of course, there are some sectors or sections of the academia that talk about the backlash of globalization, that before the pandemic, there seems to be pushbacks on the process of globalization, and also arguments that probably this was due to the rise of populism as well, to say those interests were trying to slow down processes of multilateralism. But the pandemic itself shows that there is need for countries to work together, because this disease goes beyond the ability of one state or one country to deal with, and also it does not respect borders. But what we also saw in the, especially from March to about June, there is need to, for example, consider the issue of multilateralism, uh, and also the issue of race. For example, we all know what happened in the USA, and also the backlash of what happened against that a person who died at the hands of the police. So these are some of the issues that our panelists, our able panelists, are going to discuss today. I'll introduce them in turn when they are about to speak, but just to run down the panelists, we have Professor Muhammad Marandi from the University of Tehran. We have Professor Hamid Musavi, also from the University of Tehran. And also we have Professor Amir Sahid Vakil, is also from the University of Tehran. Then we have Professor Yolanda Spies from Zayed University, that is in the United Arab Emirates. We have Professor Sam Olorun Toba, who is with the Thabo Mbeki Leadership Institute, but he's also a visiting scholar with the Carleton University. Then we have our own as hosts, Professor Isike, who is a professor in the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria. So I'll give the colleagues each one about 5 minutes just to get the discussion started, to give a brief presentation or a brief talk on how they view this issue of how we can invigorate multilateralism during this pandemic, but also after the pandemic. And maybe they could even speak to issues of whether multilateralism is needed or is essential or is necessary now and also post pandemic. So I'll first of all ask Professor Muhammad Marandi, who is a professor of American Studies, American History and Literature, colonial and post-colonial studies. He's in the Faculty of World Studies at the University of Tehran, Iran. And Professor Marandi is one of the most invited university professors of Iran in international seminars. He speaks to issues of politics, and so you will find that actually he appears on eminent political and social as an eminent and political commentator on international news networks. So if you watch PBS, for example, or RT, ABC, GTN, CNN, and all those news outlets, you see him being consulted and also giving informed opinions on that. Professor, you can go ahead. Um, I'm told Professor Marandi is having challenges with connections. So while we wait for him, I think I'll move over to Professor Hamed Musavi, who is also at the University of Tehran, but he's in the Faculty of Law and Political Sciences. He researches Israeli foreign policy, US foreign policy, and Middle East politics. And actually, interestingly, is currently working on a book on ideology in Israeli foreign policy. He also appears on as a political analyst on various channels like Press TV, IRIB, CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, and RT. Professor Musavi, you can go ahead, and then we'll get back to Professor Marandi when he gets sorted out with his connection.
Thank you very much. Is my voice clear?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. Well, hello everyone, distinguished guests. Also, hello to my fellow colleague, Dr. Vakil. We're from
Thank you
the
so
same
much.
faculty.
This is
um,
kind of you.
Thank you. So I'm going to be quick about my points. I'm going to talk about unilateralism in U.S. foreign policy, which is one of my main areas of research. So I think the main question when we talk about U.S. unilateralism, especially during the Trump era, is why is the US adopting unilateral foreign policies when the world has moved to a multilateral phase? So the world is no longer unipolar, but rather it's multipolar today. And the question is, since the US's power has declined, shouldn't it move to multilateralism? And I think to answer this question, we have to look at it from a theoretical basis. The most important theory in this regard is hegemonic stability theory. And I personally use Robert Gilpin's hegemonic cycle to analyze this. Now, in hegemonic stability theory, it says that global powers, their growth is differentiated by their domestic economic growth as well as demographic changes. So essentially, the power of great powers is constantly changing. And as a result of that, this theory tells us that all hegemonies in history eventually decline. Now, in recent years, the United States' relative power compared to other countries, say compared to China, Russia, and India, its relative power has declined. I'll give you several examples. In the 1960s, for example, the United States GDP was 40% of the world's GDP. Today, it's only about 23%. When we compare it to China, the second competitor, if we calculate nominal GDPs, there is still a big gap, like about 23 trillion for the US versus about 13 trillion for China. But if we calculate the GDP based on purchasing power parity, according to the CIA, um, China's economy is already bigger than that of the United States, with a GDP of purchasing power parity of $25 trillion, which is almost $3 trillion more than that of the United States. Another example is that US standing in power in strategic areas of the globe, such as the Middle East, has declined. Now, the result of that has been, and this is what the theory tells us as well, the result of that is that the most important factor in US foreign policy today is to prolong America's standing on the global stage. So America, to put it in Trump's words, wants to remain number one. Now, there are differences of opinion in the United States on how to achieve this. So both Democrats as well as Republican agree on the fact that the United States should adopt a foreign policy to keep its global standing. Nevertheless, there is an important difference on how to achieve this. Do you achieve this through multilateralism or unilateralism? Now, during the Obama presidency, the United States actually tried to adopt multilateral agreements such as the Paris Accords, et cetera, as well as the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, which was also a multilateral agreement. But during the Trump era, we're seeing a major shift towards unilateralism and a withdrawal from these multilateral accords. So the result has been a shift in U.S. foreign policy. Now, the pandemic, the recent coronavirus pandemic, has actually made this turn even worse. It has exasperated this. So the United States even feels more isolated because of this pandemic. And since the pandemic supposedly started in China, and since the United States has suffered the most out of all the countries in the world with over 160,000 deaths, the result has been even a more bold move towards unilateralism. So I think when the pandemic is over, we will see even a more direct move towards unilateralism by the United States, unfortunately. Unless there is a change of power in November, if that happens and Biden becomes president, the situation is, of course, going to change. But nevertheless, the structure that I talked about, the decline of the United States relative power, the rise of China, the suffering of the United States during the pandemic, all these issues will still remain the same. And all of these issues has made multilateralism if I would say, perhaps a vulnerable and risky move. It's seen as a vulnerable and risky move by U.S. strategists. Okay, I'll stop there. I think my 5 minutes is up. I'll have more to say, hopefully in the next parts of this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Musavi. That's a very interesting presentation and very great insights into multilateralism that brings in also the issue of hegemony and decline in powers of hegemonic states. I'll save my comments and questions for now and move on to Professor Vakil, who is a professor in the Faculty of Law at and Political Science, also at University of Tehran. And he works very closely with the UN offices in Tehran, and his research interests include human rights, dispute resolution, responsibility, and acts of states. He also, Professor Vakil, appears as an international law commentator in international news networks such as Press TV and IRIB. Over to you, Professor Vakil.
Thank you for having me. That's just kind of few. So let's have a brief talk about multilateralism amidst COVID-19. At the beginning, I really want to stress that on the one hand, the scope of states' discretion to act unilaterally has been ill-defined under international agreements. On the other hand, the lack of effective global judicial authority to adjudicate legality of the unilateral actions and policies provides a large room for unilateralism in international law. Contemporary international relations have changed the way states and citizens interact, and it has disrupted the traditional understanding of states and borders. These developments tend to foster multilateral cooperation and to ensure that all parties fully meet their international obligations. Therefore, rule of law leads the people to predictability of actions and policies, which make the world a safer and happier place to live. ICJ Judge Alvarez, in his separate opinion in Corfu Channel case, stated, the notion of state sovereignty has evolved, and we must now adopt a conception of it which will be in harmony with the new conditions of social life. Indeed, I am emphasizing on the new conditions of social life, which is now known as a new normal, which COVID-19 dictates. Likewise, former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, in the defining the concept of sovereignty, stated that states are now widely understood to be instruments at the service of peoples, and not vice versa. Although almost all states and international organizations recognize the right of the states to protect their national security, certainly coronavirus teaches us a state has no absolute discretion to implement its own understanding of public health, safety, and well-being. Indeed, the legitimacy of granting a state the right to invoke unilateral decisions and impose some measures must be read together with other provisions of international law. To build stability in the international community, unilateral actions may be done if they don't affect another human being's rights. Based on UN Security Council resolution on July 1st and WHO resolution on May 18 and UN General Assembly resolution on March 27, I can wrap up my observations in 3 points. 1. The poorest and most vulnerable are the hardest hit by the pandemic, and these instruments stress that there is no place for any form of discrimination and racism in the response to the pandemic because of the nature of the virus, which doesn't know any gender, any race, any ethnicity, any border, etc. 2. WHO plays the crucial role in the United Nations system in coordinating the global response to control the spread of COVID-19 based on unity, solidarity, and renewed multilateral cooperation. It proves the UN commitment to international cooperation and multilateralism. Undoubtedly, withdrawal of the United States from WHO and unilateral sanctions which United States impose against some countries like Iran diminish the potentials of international cooperations to fight against the pandemic. And 3, the need for full respect for human rights is a prerequisite to fight against pandemic relying on multilateralism. According to international human rights instruments, right to health focuses on individual persons, and relevant state party has obligation to secure the rights for their citizens. That is why I am trying to introduce a new right to public health, which might be placed on third generation of human rights, which is a right as a collective right, which is a positive right, and the right demands like responsibility beyond nation state. It's not national, it's international cooperation based. That is why whole the government, whole the society, including women and youth, and whole the international community play key role to secure this right. Solidarity requires universal, equitable, and sustainable access to health, services and commodities, technologies, and information. It refutes the proliferation of disinformation and misinformation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Musavi, for that presentation. And as I did before, we'll reserve the comments and questions later. I'll now call upon the Spies. Professor Spies is actually a native of the University of Pretoria. She is a former colleague who is currently at Zayed University in the United Arab Emirates. She is a very seasoned diplomat. I mean, she has about 19 years of experience as a diplomat, and this has taken her to about 4 continents across the world. And Professor Spies is a person that actually designed, we have a Master of Diplomatic Studies in the Department of Political Sciences. She's the designer of that program. And she's also taught in the master's program of American Webster University in Ghana. And last year, she shocked me, actually, when I looked at her profile. It was just after I'd invited her for a workshop at the University of Pretoria, and then I was just trying to put up a report, and I saw that she had published 2 books within a year. That was very amazing. Professor Spies, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Chris, and it's such a pleasure to be here with all the colleagues. I'll try to keep it short, but there's so much to say, so wish me luck. Colleagues, multilateralism is the democracy of international relations. It actually coincides with democracy taking fire all over the world as from 100 years ago. And it is there precisely because it allows us for inclusion and transparency and predictability of the rules of engagement. And above all, it gives us a collective agenda in the organizations where we practice multilateral diplomacy. But just as we see citizens of states all over the world losing their trust in democratic systems precisely because they find they are losing out in terms of inclusion, transparency, and predictability and the collective agenda, we have seen a decline in multilateralism over the past decade or so for a number of reasons, and I don't have time to go into those now. But the point is that multilateralism is changing, it is morphing, it is evolving. And I will touch upon some of these changes, and I will also indicate which, in fact, most of them have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. The first is that multilateralism has become much more flexible and supple and innovative and ad hoc. So we see now that within organizations, we find states engaging in minilateralism. That is a form of multilateralism within multilateralism. Some people refer to it as plurilateralism. But that's not just limited to multilateralism within organizations. States also form ad hoc associations around organizations, sometimes just issue-based, sometimes just for a very short period until a specific issue is resolved. And this gives new opportunities to reach common ground. I'm thinking in this case, for example, of Mexico's proposal to the United Nations that prophylaxis and vaccines for the COVID-19 pandemic should be universally available. And 179 states have actually signed up to that idea. And South Africa, now being on the Security Council for a few months still to go, should drive that initiative. It doesn't matter that Mexico, for example, is not a member of the Security Council right now. There should be that kind of networking. Then secondly, yes, the AI revolution, the fourth industrial revolution preceded the COVID-19 pandemic, but we see this outburst of the use of technology now to facilitate multilateral diplomacy, doing precisely what we are doing at this moment. And it's more cost effective, it's more health effective, and I think it's here to stay. People will return to the summits and the physical locations, but we are now learning that you can draw on expertise from around the world while not spending the resources on drawing those people together. And this is something that we should have done long ago. But then also one extra thing, during the COVID pandemic, we tend to underplay the environmental crisis that the world is facing. But it's with us and it's not going to subside. And I think the idea that we are now traveling less to international conferences and summits is something that's also going to stay. The question then is, what impact will this have on the diplomatic practice of individual states? And coming from Africa, I cannot help but think of the digital divide, the fact that some states are going to be lagging even further behind than they have thus far. So I think development assistance, not just in addressing the health issues that are obviously urgent right now, but also in addressing information and communications technology, will become much more pronounced. States, not just poorer states, but states all over the world, will try to save resources in the face of massive economic hardship caused by the pandemic. And this will mean that they might tone down on the population of their diplomats. Diplomats deployed might be reduced, more work to be done from head offices, more strategizing and coordination from head office, and definitely more ITC training for diplomats, and also more training in networking in crisis situations such as the one we're dealing with right now, to involve technocrats, in this case of COVID pandemic, scientists and health professionals, in solving the problems that diplomats are faced with. Just a comment on what a previous speaker said about the decline in United States multilateralism. Indeed, we are seeing a decline of Western leadership in multilateral forums. And I don't think that even if there is a change in administration in the United States, that this is likely to change from a US perspective. And the reason I'm saying that is because the US is a deeply divided society. It is dealing with deep schisms, partisanship, racism, economic damage caused by the pandemic. And I think especially if it is a Democratic Party administration, that they will be inwardly focused on healing their own society. Same can be said about Europe. Europe post-Brexit is a divided continent, and what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic really disrobed Europe. This sense of we are all in it for everybody's good. Just ask the Italians what they think of how much the Europeans were helping them during this pandemic. So the decline of Western leadership in multilateral forums is creating new structural power vacancies, if I can put it that way. And I think for us coming from the developing world and from the poorer regions of the world, we should be very strategic, but also not too rushed, to align ourselves with any emerging power poles, because I think all of this is in flux. And we see a new Cold War emerging between the US and China. And Africa, for example, should not, as we did during the original Cold War, be forced into choosing any sides just because we're desperate for resources. We have resources that the rest of the world should be desperate about. So just in summary, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on multilateralism is both in the form of multilateralism, meaning the methodologies used, and in the substance thereof. Just as a final comment, it highlights, if we haven't been certain of this previously, the nexus between human security and traditional state security. And it highlights this urgency for the United Nations Security Council to align itself with this security agenda. And simultaneously, then we have the problem that that same council might be completely overloaded. So we're going to have to think flexibly and innovatively about the structures that we need for the world to take this beyond the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you so much, Professor Spies. I'm almost tempted to start making comments immediately from that presentation, but I'll hold my fire. And I see that Professor Mohammed is not yet back, but I'll then move to Professor Oloruntova, who is an associate professor at the Thabo Mbeki African Leadership Institute here in South Africa. But he's also a visiting scholar at Carleton University at the Institute of African Studies. Professor Oloruntova has also visited Northwestern University in the US and Brown Advanced Research Institute at Brown University. He is an author and editor of several books. One of his most recent publications is actually Regionalism and Integration in Africa, where he examines the EU-ACP economic partnership agreements. But that's just one of his, because I'm aware last month he published an edited volume on, I think, Pan-Africanism, something like that. He is also a rated researcher here in Pretoria with the NRF. Professor Oloruntova, please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thanks to all the participants. The COVID-19 came like a thunderbolt, like I would say, and it has challenged our whole essence of understanding of humanity. And when I say that, it tells us about how no one is exempted. No one. I mean, like one of the speakers said, it doesn't respect race, it doesn't respect color, and to me, it provides a new opportunity for us to rethink the multilateral system, in the sense that the existing multilateral system has been organized from post-1945 in ways that favor different parts of the world differently, with developing countries, region like Africa, being at the backside with rigged international trade rule, international financial architecture that has not been organized to work, to advance inclusive development in third world countries. So COVID-19 has provided an opportunity for us to rethink this system, because as we know, it has affected different parts of the world differently. Of course, there was a shock that developed countries can be so hard hit, like US, like some European countries could be so hard hit as they were affected by COVID-19. In terms of the number of casualties, fatalities that have been recorded. So I think that what needs to be done in terms of economy, I speak about the economy, is that we need to rethink the role of international engagement. And to me, the withdrawal of the US as more or less the sole superpower of the international system create an opportunity for new leadership of the international system in ways that will ensure that trade rules advance development. Danny Roderick once said, can global governance of trade be restructured to advance development? We need to think about that, because as it is now, there's going to be a long-term fallout of COVID-19 in terms of how it affects countries in developing region. Many of the countries in Africa are already debt-ridden, and this is going to increase their debt burden. What is the IMF going to do to ensure that the debt burden is reduced? I just read yesterday that my country, Nigeria, is spending more than maybe 40% of the revenue to service debt. How sustainable can that be post-COVID-19? They have been called for the IMF to issue a special drawing right that will ensure that money is released for countries in developing regions to bolster their economy, to stimulate jobs after COVID-19. But how, to what extent will this happen? So what I just want to summarize is that there are efforts at the global level right now to ensure that vaccines are developed, but it has to be done in ways that ensure universal access. Because if you make vaccine available on the basis of populism, on the basis of nationalism that we are seeing today, it's going to be counterproductive. Because I mean, travel will eventually be open, and people will have to travel. So if we nationalize vaccine, it's going to make the outcome to be very suboptimal. So it is necessary for the multilateral system to be rethink, to be restructured in ways that advance development. And let me go back to what I said earlier on, that the eclipse, I don't want to say the eclipse of the US, the withdrawal of the US, and Yolanda was very right that even Democratic Party takeover in January next year, it does not necessarily mean that America will change its policy. I like what you said about the need for strategy, which is the point I've always been talking about, that no matter the nature of this multilateral system, is always defined by the interests of the key actors. That's what IR tells us. Africa needs to restructure its strategy of engagement in ensuring that, one, the domestic economy is strong, two, political stability is ensured to advance development. That even when we sign the African Continental Free Trade Area or free trade agreement, which we rejoice so much over, if there's no strategy, it's not going to advance development in Africa. So we should ensure that the post-COVID-19 multilateral system is based on advancement of humanity. It's based on advancement of humanity, based on strategy of inclusive development. Nationalism has never led to any sustained development. Yes, it can appeal to voters, it can show up your power image, but in the long run, it's always very counterproductive. So there's a need for a multilateral system that is organized in a way that advances humanity. And let me close by saying that the eclipse, the vacancy, the vacuum that we see today create opportunity for country. About 3 or 4 weeks ago, Canada, South Korea, South Africa, and many countries, they signed a statement to say that, look, let there be a universal access to vaccine. I think we need a new coalition of the willing, not for war, but for peace and inclusive development. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Oloruntova, for that. Again, I'll call on the attendees. If you have any questions, we are shortly going to have a question and answer session, but you can also type your questions in the Q&A space there in the chat, and then we are going to read them out to the participants. I hear Professor Mohammed has connected through the Professor Musavi's link. So I'll hand over to Professor Mohammed. I've already introduced you while you were offline. Please go ahead.
Thank you and good afternoon, and sorry for the delayed connection. I think that we are about to witness major changes in the global economic order as well as the global political order. Coronavirus has only exacerbated major systematic problems or systemic problems that exist in Western economies, and especially that of the United States. The major debts that both the government of the United States holds, as well as that which the private individuals own, are not things that can be resolved easily. And the United States, after the bailout in 2008 and 2009, has only exacerbated the problem. And now that the coronavirus has hit, the expected results of the unprecedented transfer of wealth from ordinary Americans to the rich in 2008 and 2009 have reached their inevitable result. And what the US government has done in response has only been to make things worse by an even larger bailout. And we have witnessed recently over the last couple of months the greatest transfer of wealth from poor to rich in human history, which has greatly surpassed what we saw in 2008 and 2009. And thus, I believe that the United States is heading for a major economic depression. And Europe, for reasons that are both connected and other reasons, such as the crises inside the European Union itself and the problems that the European Union will have in managing its affairs and the divisions that exist between poorer European states or Southern European states in Germany and other countries may actually lead to the breakup of the European Union from what it, or at least the breakup from the current borders that we see today. This will, of course, have consequences across the world.
We seem to be losing Professor Muhammad there. Okay, but in the meantime, if you have any comments, anyone any participants, we welcome comments and questions. You can post them in the Q&A box, and then we'll respond to them. But now, while we again wait for Professor Muhammad to reconnect, we are going to call upon Professor Isike. It's only right that we make him the last speaker because we are the hosts. Normally, one of the traditional ethics in Africa is that you treat your guests first and then you go last if you are feeding them, and so on and so forth. So Professor Isike is a professor in the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria. And he is actually currently the vice president, one of 4 vice presidents of the International Political Science Association. He last year, 2 years ago, was also president of the South African Association of Political Studies. He is also an NRF, or National Research Foundation rated scholar here in Pretoria. Professor Isike is an editor-in-chief of one of Africa's foremost political journals, which is Politicon, South Africa Journal of Political Sciences. He consults and works with the UNFPA, UNICEF, UN Women, and the KwaZulu-Natal provincial government is one of the provinces here in South Africa. Professor Oloruntoba, sorry, Professor Isike, over to you. Apologies for that.
All right, thank you very much, Chris. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yes,
Great.
yes.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon, colleagues, and nice to see your face, Yolanda. It's been a while, and Samuel as well. Look, when I was asked to be part of the panel, Chris told me to look at the 6 broad issue or question areas and decide on which one to talk from. And I looked at it and told myself that, well, I'm going to pick the one that I assume, and I've been proven correctly, that no one would talk about. That is multilateralism and the fight against racism. So that is what I chose to prepare myself to talk about. And no one has talked about it, so it makes sense for me to have decided to do that. So for me, a starting point in discussing the place of multilateralism in the fight against racism is to acknowledge 2 things. One is that multilateralism is an approach to international relations, right? And 2, international relations itself is built on racism. Now, for me, therefore, using multilateralism as a tool of fighting, racism will also require challenging the racist origins of IR and the racially unequal system of states we currently have today. So otherwise, this exercise will be like asking a corrupt president to fight corruption or root out corruption in a state. And what is likely going to happen is that at best will be the prosecution of the president's enemies, which in some ways will reduce corruption, but will also increase and reproduce it in many other ways, right? So therefore, it is important to acknowledge the historical legacy of systemic racism and the enduring inequalities it has created globally to be able to use multilateralism as a tool to effectively fight against, racism globally. So having said that, I would like to just quickly talk about 2 points. The first point would be discussing just a comment or 2 about the ideological and geographic origins of IR, which are products of intellectual racism. And then secondly, to talk about the fact that colonialism and decolonialism have played a very important role in, the inequality between states that we currently experience, which also is associated with racism because of the racialized hierarchies of the system. And then the last point I will talk about would be some practical suggestions, that can help, to answer the question of how, in the context that I would paint around multilateralism in an unequal world, this can become useful to fight racism. Now, to the question of the ideological and geographic origins of IR, being products of intellectual racism, I'm sure you all know that mainstream IR is generally and predominantly premised on assumptions of Western thinkers about the Western, dominated world and Western norms and values. Observations of realism, for example, about the imperfect and natural state of the world is rooted in European political experience and history, and without regards for non-European or non-Western, if you like, political experience and history, including their own experiences as well. So the political states assumed is the nation state, a particular tradition of statehood traced back to the 17th century Germany. Claims of idealism, liberalism, assume values and progress as conceived in, from Western vantage points on the post-1945 world order, right? So constructivist and, related theories derived from European historical experiences that foreground how international realities are historically and socially constructed. And maybe this is where also, multilateralism can also be useful in terms of social construction. Now, even Marxist claims are principally about the 19th century Europe and the impact of capitalism on that society, extrapolated to the rest of the world where Western capitalism, spreads to. So that's my first point. My second point will be to acknowledge the central role of colonialism, because this is related to the first, and decolonization in creating the current international order that is made up of more marginal states than we have core states. Now, this has perpetuated global inequalities that are not only economic, but also racial, based on fraudulent ontological ascriptions. So the history of the modern state system I mentioned earlier is precisely the period of colonial expansion and settlement that saw European states consolidate, their domination over other parts of the world and over other populations who came to be represented in very racialized terms. According to Gomenda Bambra, this external domination is rarely described or discussed or theorized as a constitutive aspect of the so-called modern state, which then is imperial as much as national. The racialized hierarchies of empire define the broader polity beyond the state, according to her. And after decolonization, these have continued to construct inequalities of citizenship within states, as you have, currently, as the world saw in the United States, that have recently become national as well as international, in the face of the global protests or support for Black Lives Matter, protests across different parts of the world, not just in the United States, not just in Europe, in Asia and in Africa, as well. So Bambara concludes that very quite profoundly that race isn't a factor that enters so-called nation states from the outside. Rather, they are racialized from the very moment of their emergence as imperial polities and continue to reproduce racialized hierarchies to this day. Now, this brings me to the more practical question of how, in this context of multilateralism, how multilateralism can be a useful tool to fight racism. So I will just say two things and then stop and hope that we can carry on through a question and answer session. Now, the first being that the United Nations can give meaning. The United Nations being a multilateral organization or institution can give meaning to an emerging multiplex world, as was espoused by Amitav Acharya, by expanding the United Nations Security Council to make it more representative, of all continents of the world. Now, this is not just for the sake of equity and representativity, but more for the values, the norms and ideas, and as well as resources that these continents have to offer and are already offering. And in some cases have been offering from the beginning of this so-called modern state system and the international system that we currently have. So if we are serious about fighting the racialized international political system and its practices, we must first come to terms with the erasure of the roles of non-Western political actors and societies, the roles that they have played, especially in shaping, global affairs. The second suggestion I would make, apart from that of expanding the United Nations Security Council, would be for us academics, ourselves, that we do have agency, as IR scholars, diplomats, and development scholars. We should therefore use this agency to begin to include analysis of race, of racism, colonialism, paternalism, and even talks about reparations in the study of international, of the international and present-day North-South relations. Now, the idea for me is to study and question the current international system that is built on racial capitalism, so that the imagination of other alternatives can become possible. So let me stop here and hope that I would be able to talk more about this during the Q&A sessions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Isike, for that presentation. And as I've said, participants, you are free to ask your questions, and you can even indicate who your questions are directed to in the chat box there. But maybe just to kick off the discussion, I see that all presenters, there's a sense in which touched on the fact that the multilateral system as it is currently constituted and structured seems to be skewed in terms of the processes and also just its status and condition. There seems to be a group of countries or maybe a country that it works in favor of those, and Africa particularly has been flagged as being disadvantaged. So that seems to be a common thread across all the presentations. There's also the mention of course, we are talking about multilateralism. I'm not surprised that the UN came into the conversation, but I think there will be questions that need addressing with regard to the UN. But before I go to that, I would like to maybe just ask for some clarification and a comment maybe from Professor Musavi. And this is on an issue that all the presenters, I think, kind of touched on, which relates to the politics in the US, but not the US per se, but the US as a dominant power, traditionally dominant power in the global system. So it was about unilateralism and also hegemony of the US. But my question really to Professor Musavi is, you did talk about the Trump administration and maybe the possibility of a change of government to the Democrats under Biden. So my question would be, considering the multilateral system and notions of hegemony, to what extent do individuals, so in this case, if let's say Biden becomes president as an individual, to what extent in the multilateral system would you say individuals have influence on global agenda setting and even on processes that happen at multilateral level? So as an individual who occupies is the office of maybe a dominant power.
Thank you for that question, Chris. Yes, I mean, in the American system, the president actually wields a lot of power. And if Biden wins the election, it's not going to be just him. I mean, the whole Democratic Party is much more inclined towards multilateralism compared to the Republican Party. So we are going to see a change, I think. But the extent of the change, like you say, will be impacted by systemic forces. When the Cold War ended, the United States, especially during the era of Bill Clinton, was actually a promoter of multilateralism in the world. It relied on the UN, the Security Council, even on cultural institutions such as UNESCO. But this started to really change after 9/11. And I wouldn't say it was only because of 9/11. I think the United States, whenever it feels that it is under pressure, whenever it is vulnerable, it feels the need towards moving towards unilateralism. And it feels that it is being hurt by multilateral institutions as well as multilateral agreements. So if we come back to the virus pandemic, because of the huge impact it's had on the United States. I mean, uh, 40 million people in the United States have lost their jobs because of this pandemic. And the economy is slowly starting to get better, but nevertheless, the US has suffered greatly by this pandemic. And once the pandemic is over, the United States will feel more inclined towards unilateralism, even if Biden wins. Nevertheless, again, going back to the first point, it is definitely going to change from the Trump administration. I mean, Biden and his team is very different from Trump and his team. So I would say probably a change somewhere in between, not zero, not 100, but somewhere in between. We will see change if he wins, of course. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that comment. Professor Vakil, I see Yolanda's hand up. Maybe I'll let her speak before I pose my question. Please go ahead.
No,
Chris,
please go ahead.
I just want to add something on individual
Please hold.
leadership.
Let's. I think I'll. Sorry, I'll allow Professor Speed to speak.
I had no question, Chris.
Thank you so much for that comment.
Chris, I would like to add something about individual leadership because it touches on questions of symbolism in international relations, on identity, race, as we're seeing in the US at the moment, the importance of Biden having chosen Kamala Harris as his VP. But I also want to warn against over expectations of people, individuals in positions simply because they happen to be of a certain race or certain gender. Take, for example, the African position holders in multilateral organizations. Take, for example, the International Criminal Court. The fact that the chief prosecutor is a Gambian prosecutor, the fact that the chief president judge president of the International Criminal Court is Nigerian. Take the World Health Organization under Dr. Tedros, the fact that he's African. When we campaign for people to fill positions, we also have to enable them to make the most of those positions. We cannot just install them and hope that their mere presence, the symbolism will be enough. And here I want to refer back to the presidency of Barack Obama, who, in my opinion, is one of the finest individuals that one could choose for any position. However, he did not substantively change the well-being of African Americans. He did not substantively improve US relations with Africa. And those were expectations that perhaps we had that were too high of an individual. So whilst the symbolism is important, we also have to understand that those people deal with specific constraints and that we need to perhaps have more realistic expectations and also put mechanisms in place to strengthen them in terms of networking and support from inside and outside their organizations.
Thank you so much, Yolanda, for that comment. It really does make a sense, and what it raises in me is that does that therefore mean that even around individuals, is there a need to, I'm thinking as an African, is there a need to, when you are propping up an individual, to also make sure that you build structures around them that will go with them into the position that you are propping them up to. And this moves me to the second question that I wanted to ask for comments from Professor Vakil. And all the presenters did touch on the UN system. And my question really, or comment, particularly with regard to the WHO and the fact that you did mention that it's played a very central role. It is playing a central role actually in the fight against coronavirus. But then in the midst of all this, of course, we know the US has withdrawn or funding or support, but then there were also calls from countries like Australia, for example, saying that there is need to investigate the the WHO in terms of the way it has responded to the virus. But for me, I think there's even a deeper and a longer standing question, not only of the WHO, but the entire UN system, and also other multilateral organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, to say, no, these institutions need to be reformed. And so my question is, how do we move forward post-pandemic with regard to this? Should we go back to those long-standing questions and to say there's need to really reform and restructure these institutions, or should we carry on with what we have already?
Perfect. I think before going through your, question, I need to mention two main and important points. First of all, there is a paradoxical issue in international law, at least, because we are talking about how can we enhance multilateralism, while according to basics and fundamentals of international law, unilateralism is not totally and absolutely rejected. I mean, sometimes unilateralism may help to develop international law, may help to develop customary international law. And sometimes we should imagine that unilateralism is really helpful to develop international provisions. So, in that case, I think we should make a balance between multilateralism and unilateralism. In the United Nations system, it is the same, because when we go through Security Council, we see that there are five powers in the United Nations system. Because of the veto rights, they can apply some sort of unilateralism even in the United Nations system, which is based on democratic international relations and democratic system. So this is the first point that I would like to mention. That the second point is that according to the Security Council resolution, it says extent of the pandemic is likely to endanger the maintenance of international peace and security. So it is a very clear sentence that shows, unfortunately, the Security Council is hesitant to deal with coronavirus and to this pandemic as a exactly clear threat to international peace and security, because of some maybe tensions between five big powers. So now going through your question, I think it's clear for all of us that the United Nations system has some failures, and we need to make some reforms about how it works. There are some, suggestions. I remembered 2004 and 2005, a group of experts tried to suggest that what are the suggestions that we can make to improve the function of the United Nations, and to know how can this system go further. According to the reports that experts which were appointed by the UN General Secretary Kofi Annan, they had some suggestions, for example, about the composition of the Security Council, about redefinition of peace, international peace and security. As one of the panelists mentioned, that focusing on human security and some other, suggestions. I think the pandemic is a great chance for all of us, for all of the countries, for all the peoples, all the world, to contribute more and more in making international norms and in being more, active player to just provide some suggestions, just provide some ideas that how the peoples and countries may be more active players in the international plane and international scale. So I think the critics about WHO or whole the United Nations system is, of course, are some concerns that we should take a look at them. But in this point, because of some political motivations or because of some other motivations, it is not good time to diminish or weaken the services and functions of WHO, because at this point it will weaken and it will affect the efficiency of WHO while we are fighting with this pandemic.
Okay, I see you also touch on issues of international norms, and this actually does also maybe relate to some of the comments that Professor
efficiency of WHO while we are fighting.
Sorry, I got cut off there. Can you hear me, everyone?
Now I can hear you. Yeah.
Yes, but can you repeat your question, please?
Sorry, I think I'm having challenges with my network. So if I disappear, please, I've not run away. But anyway, Professor Vikal did touch on one of the issues that Professor Oloruntova and Professor Isike raised that relate to international norms, but also maybe the issue of rethinking. So a question I would have for Professor Oloruntova and Professor Isike in relation to norms, international norms, first of all would be, if we are talking about reforming the international system and introducing maybe touching on the international norms that govern the current multilateral system, then whose norms would we want to project? Of course, I'm aware we have a lawyer in the webinar, but still, at the end of the day, whose norms do we want to predominantly project? And in view of what Professor Isike was saying, when you look at the discipline of international relations, it tends to be Eurocentric. And so therefore, we can't run away from the fact that European norms define the international system in that respect. But then particularly to Professor Oloruntova, my question is that if you are saying the pandemic provides an opportunity to rethink, and I'm thinking as an African now to say, how do you then suggest that Africa should move into the space that is left vacant, one? But secondly, how do we also make sure that we don't get into a situation where speaking in realist terms, we create an anarchic situation where countries start to literally compete to be number one instead of working together to redefine the multilateral system? How do you then suggest that Africa should move
okay. Professor Zike, you want to come first or should I go first?
You can go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Well, IR and the impact you have in foreign policy is a function of your domestic environment. You don't wish it, you plan it, you act it. So for Africa to be relevant in the international system, we just first need to fix our houses. We've got to fix our domestic economy. We've got to fix our politics. We've got to fix our citizens. Because it is not, like I keep saying, it is not like a family thing. It's interest. It's aggregation of interest. It's maximization of interest. So that is very clear. And at the international level, we keep saying that none of the countries in Africa can actually have the capacity to project, a foreign policy that can be inclusive of the whole continent. And therefore, the African Union needs to act better in a more coordinated way to ensure that African foreign policy, is put in place. There's European foreign policy, there's American foreign policy. The question is, what is African foreign policy? Togo has its own foreign policy, Benin has its own foreign policy. To what extent can it exert any meaningful pressure in the international system? That's why the issue of regional integration is very important. And of course, like we said, the norms of international relation post-1945 reflect the liberal international order. But again, as liberal as we claim that it is also based on realist principle of the survival of the fittest. So we need to rethink, I would advocate a principle of shared humanity. Because the point is, if you are okay today, you are powerful today, there's no assurance that in the next 50 years, you are going to be powerful. So the question you need to ask yourself is, how would I feel if I'm the underdog here? It was so funny about 4 months ago that some Italians traveled to Ethiopia when COVID-19 was hitting Italy hard. They were not ready to go back to Italy. And they were the same Italians that are sending migrants back. So that just made a point that we need a new international system that is constructed around compassion, that is constructed around humanity. Like we keep saying, John Mayer King said, in the long run, we are all gone. We know that we are not yet in the celestial city that St. Augustine talked about, but we can restructure international system in ways that ensure co-development, like Samir Amin will talk about, co-development, dual development, that is not just going to be, oh, I'm the most powerful country in the world, like Donald Trump has been saying. To what use is that? To what use is that? So I would think we need an international system that is based on peace, mutual respect, and shared humanity, which bind all of us together, regardless of race, regardless of religion, regardless of geography. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Oloruntoba. Prof. Isike, the discipline itself, of course, when we look at places like Africa, the state in Africa, you read the international relations literature, we are given the idea or the understanding that states in Africa are failed, they are poor, they are on the margins. So how do you bring then those that are on the margins in the discipline, how do you bring them to the center to share that space in understanding of international relations and also the multilateral?
Well, first, let me start by saying that we are not living in the 1940s or 50s anymore, and the institutions and structures that were created in that time are no longer relevant, for today. They are actually in themselves currently under stress. That's why the original sponsor of post-war multilateralism in economic regimes, that is the United States, has turned towards unilateral and bilateral confrontations, in trade and other negotiations as a result of the frustrations with the intricacies of consensus building in a multilateral world. So, as the most powerful member of the international community, the U.S. Has less to lose from the withdrawal in this nature. Countries like the poorer countries like we have in Africa, for instance, will be the ones that will suffer more from the U.S. withdrawal from the World Health Organization, for example. But look, and this is what Amitav talks about in his multiplex world order, where we need to talk about recognizing the values, norms and ideas that other continents and other countries of the world, apart from the mainstream ones, can contribute and have in fact been, contributing. So for me, countries in the margins, although there are scholars that have said Africa has never really been in the margins, but have been at the center, that argument is there. But for Africa to be relevant, for African thoughts, political thoughts, for instance, and contributions to political international relations theory to be mainstreamed into IR theory, we must start from the basis of international engagement itself. We know that in a non-traditional world, we have more different actors apart from states, emerging every day. But states are still primary players. Even when you look at the arguments made by people like Mohamed Ayub around the fact that the state, especially in the developing world, is still the primary mode of organization. So the question for us would be to begin to rethink and interrogate what we call states in Africa, whether they are indeed states in the true essence of the word, and if not, whether we cannot begin to recraft and rethink them and redesign them in such a way that they will become more meaningful in terms of meeting the purpose that states are supposed to be created for. So I think that once we have stronger states in Africa, when I say strong states, I do not mean the kind of responsible statism as we have in China, but I'm talking about states that respond to the needs, the socioeconomic needs of its people. If we have those kinds of stronger states, it will be easy for us to begin to form or adopt common multilateral positions. In Africa, we already have our norms that define our international engagement. One of them is consensus building. Another one is solidarity. Now, when we have states that the citizens of the continent have been part of recrafting, we can come together and form common agendas that will be meaningful, realistic to the people, and then solidarity, consensus building, common positions, which are norms that define our international relations in Africa, for instance, will become more meaningful. But so as we have them, there is a disconnect between African citizens and the states, so-called state entities. There needs to be, a merger of these differences to have something that is really common, and then from there we can begin to build from the inside out within the continent and outside the continent in future, if you ask me.
Thank you so much, Prof. Isike. Prof. Mohammed Marandi, we missed you there, but I just wanted to catch up and follow up on one of the comments that you made in your brief presentation, and basically it relates to one of the areas that are of interest to me and in the center that I work in, which have to do with issues of distribution of wealth. And you did talk about, for example, that although you didn't finish saying, but you were talking about the transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich. So my question really is for you to touch on that, but also maybe in a multilateral system in the context of a global political economy, how do you work at making sure that that distribution doesn't work towards in a pyramid form towards a minority at the top, but that it has to come down to the majority at the bottom?
Well, again, I'd like to apologize because I haven't heard what my colleagues have said, so some of what I say may be repetitive or may be irrelevant. But the point that I was trying to make was that what is going on in the United States will have major ramifications for the global economy, and that this transfer of wealth is going to lead to greater instability in the United States. The issue of Black Lives Matter is no longer simply an issue of race. It's become much more than that. It's become an issue of social injustice, where the vast majority of Americans are becoming increasingly disenfranchised. This is no longer the United States of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, which had the #1 infrastructure in the world. After the Second World War, the United States was roughly half of the global economy, the GDP. And in the 1960s, it was roughly 40%, if I'm not mistaken. that has declined, but now also within the United States, the middle class, especially since 2008 and 2009, has collapsed for the most part. And the point that this leads me to is that this is leading the United States to an economic depression. Coronavirus has made this much worse. And that will bring a great slowdown in the global economy. And there are countries that may not remain as a result. For example, a country like Saudi Arabia, which is waging war in Yemen, a crazy and foolish war, but a war nevertheless in Yemen for years. It is depleting its resources, and its oil wealth is decreasing rapidly. And at the same time, the sovereign funds of these countries are becoming less valuable because, for example, if a government purchases a football team in Europe under the new circumstances that we're living through today, and in the coming months and years with the global economic depression, the value of these assets will decline dramatically. So the point that I'm, again, stressing is that we're entering new circumstances. And I think it will have negative ramifications globally because the global economy will deteriorate. But it does have one advantage, and that is that the hegemon is going to be weakened. And that, so while these new challenges will be arising, there is an opportunity to establish a new global order. And that's where multilateralism finds a new meaning. And that's where the global South can have a much greater voice in the future. With the deepening divisions also between the United States and China, which is being foolishly managed by Trump, and the gradual or rapid decoupling of the economy, depending on which segments of the economy, the two economies that we look at, that also provides new opportunities for the global South, because those divisions provide a deeper rivalry and a fragmentation of a global order, which was without a doubt Eurocentric, which was without a doubt led by the United States within the framework of the United Nations, the UN Security Council, and all sorts of other institutions that are led in the West, many of them financial and many otherwise. So the argument that I'm making is that the United States is heading for major problems. Europe is heading for major problems. Many countries will be facing existential challenges, especially those countries that have a large service sector. Turkey is in serious trouble because it's very much dependent on tourism. Saudi Arabia, very much dependent on oil. So those countries that have a large service sector or that are dependent on commodities like oil will be facing serious trouble. But also the rest of the global community will be facing, in my opinion, very, very severe challenges that could lead to states it raises questions about the future sustainability of some of the states, to be very blunt. And it's not something that I would like to think about too much because it is something that is deeply concerning. But in any case, in this mess that the world is heading towards, there are opportunities. And I think the theme of the discussion that you've been having today, even though I have not had the privilege to be able to hear a lot of what was said, or most of what was said, this does provide us with challenges, yet it provides us also with opportunities. And I think that countries like Iran and South Africa, as well as other countries in the global South that have a stronger status, that they should move together and find mechanisms to bring about real multilateralism. We cannot wait for the whole of Africa to come together. It's probably never going to happen. Or the whole of Latin America to come together because it's too fragmented. But key countries do have the opportunity to manage this transition, this very messy transition, or at least to have a role in managing affairs in this very messy transition.
Thank you so much. I think your comment also partly touches on one of the response to one of the questions that is asked in the chat here to say what Iran and South Africa can do to reinvigorate multilateralism in a joint act. I think if when you speak of countries in the South, to say they have an opportunity to engage with one another. But also maybe before I bring in other comments and questions from the participants out there, Professor Spies, I think
May
you've
I just
touched.
respond to this question very briefly about
Yes,
China?
yes,
Very,
please.
in just a couple of sentences. And that is that one of the major problems is that because of the sheer importance of Chinese-US trade, the Chinese were never really serious about rivals to the United States. So for example, whenever Iran wanted to establish stronger ties with China, China was always wary because of the sheer power of the United States and because of the enormous economic relationship, which continues to be enormous. But as this fragmentation increases, as this decoupling decreases and the trade relationship becomes more problematic and also declines, relatively speaking, in importance, both sides will be looking for new allies. Both sides will be looking for other countries to work with for leverage. And this is where I think China can play a more important role, and that China will probably be willing to give greater concessions to countries, and especially independent countries in the global south. But this, of course, is just hypothetical. I may be wrong, but this is at least how I see it.
Okay, thank you so much for that. And you do touch on China. I think I'll go back to and uh, related to that. Of course, there's been the blame, for example, in the past that China was a polluter environmentally and was not paying its equal share in terms of you know, environmental degradation. But you did touch on that very interesting issue to say, while we are talking about the pandemic, we still have this issue of the environmental crisis that is not being addressed. But also besides that, I think you touched on an interesting issue of the fourth industrial revolution and the fact that it's also something that is worth looking at, especially in the multilateral system. My question with regard to the fourth industrial revolution in particular still revolves around those that are less connected, to say what do you do about them in order to ensure that they are not left behind as you move forward.
Sorry, Chris, are you directing this to me now?
Yes.
Okay,
You
right. Sorry,
talk
no,
of, yes.
I was just writing down something here for a moment, so I was not following your eyes. Yes, Chris, it has to do with strategic vision and pooling our resources and making sure that we speak with this one voice when we engage the external community. I'm talking about the community external to Africa. And I'm going to jump around to a few things here because there are so many things rushing through my mind now. Professor Oloruntoba, you working at T. Mali. Now, the person who inspired T. Mali sought a counterweight to the G7 when he initiated IPSA back in 2003. And he was also so prevalent, Thabo Mbeki, at G7, then G8 meetings. He actually attended more of those meetings than George W. Bush himself. So he conceptualized the idea of a G7 of the South to counter the G7 of the Western Hemisphere. And that didn't turn out. At that stage, it evolved into IPSA. But what I want to say was that the G7 actually, as a result of Mbeki's agency, engaged with 5 outreach countries, India, Brazil, China, South Africa, and Mexico. And when the world went into crisis in 2007, 2008, the G7 was so patently not up to the job of fixing the world's economy because the problems started in G7 economies, that the G20 was born of that crisis. And that just speaks to what Prof. Olorontoba posted here in the chat, which I was just reading, the sense that there is an opportunity in the crisis. World War II destroyed the notion that the League of Nations could fix the problems of the world, and it was the birth of the United Nations 75 years ago. And back then, there were just a handful of sovereign states, and that made it much more easy for the dominant states to dictate to the others what the norms should be that underwrite those institutions. But we now have another opportunity that is actually inherent to this crisis that we're dealing with. And I want to get back to your question about lagging behind with information and communications technology, this whole fourth industrial. We should now make this part of a package deal in order to take the world forward. Now, I know that President Ramaphosa, in his position as chair of the AU at the moment, he did raise the issue of a debt relief program for Africa at the most recent G20 summit. This should be broadened. It should be a package deal. It should not just be debt relief. It should be access to any prophylaxis or vaccines for COVID. It should also be linked to the ICT connectivity that is going to help societies to move beyond COVID-19. So what I'm saying is that Africa has agency. We have seen it happen. It is not something that we just talk about. We need to reclaim that space. But in order to do so, the African Union needs to speak from the same script. And what we saw recently, when Kenya was elected to a seat on the Security Council, but it was opposed by, was it Eritrea? Djibouti. That was a cleavage in the African Union, and immediately we lost our continental legitimacy. So going forward from this point, we need the African Union to speak in a very strong and booming voice to make sure that whatever the post-COVID-19 landscape is, that it is going to be one that is in favor of Africa's development, that we're not left behind.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. We're slowly drawing towards the end of our time. So start with if you can one or two comments just to wrap up the presentation, but also in view of the fact that we have this multilateralism and also going forward. The broad question I have for all of you is, would you favor multilateralism going forward, or would you rather say we should all go to our own shells and then proceed with life after that? That's the broad question that I'm asking each of you, but then please, Professor Musavi, your last comments. We have this multilateralism and also going forward.
Sorry, can you repeat the end of your question? I got the first part where you said if you prefer multilateralism to unilateralism, but what was the second part? Sorry.
Yes, it's basically your take on the issue of multilateralism going forward in what is the so-called new normal, and whether you'd promote or you'd be an advocate of multilateralism, or countries should go it alone and engage the international system on their own. What is your position, and in view of the broad topic that we had today?
Okay, in a very summarized fashion, I would definitely say that multilateralism is preferred to unilateralism. Unilateralism can be very dangerous it can lead to large consequences. One example was the United States invasion of Iraq in 2003, which led to a domino effect in the Middle East, eventually leading to the rise of ISIS and terrorism. And we all know how unilateralism can be very dangerous for global affairs. Nevertheless, I think at the end of the day, whether we will have multilateralism or unilateralism in the world will depend on the behavior of great powers, such as the United States, which we talked about, but also about Europeans. The Europeans have been very concerned about the Trump administration and its unilateral policies in the past 3.5 years. And essentially, they are trying to, if you say, divide their path from that of the United States, but they haven't been successful as of yet. So I think it's quite uncertain what kind of a world we will have after the pandemic. But maybe I'm a narcissist or maybe a realist, but I would say I think we will actually see more unilateralism than before the pandemic, unfortunately.
Okay. Thank you so much. Professor Vakil.
Yeah, I think I'm at the position to say that we cannot forget none of them. I mean, multilateralism and unilateralism both are necessary for making a regulation in international law and international relations. So the golden point is that how can we make a balance between these two necessary notions for international relations and international law? I think it is the main point that we should go through shape an international legal system, universal legal system, which declares each state, each individual, each international organization, and even non-state actors, how they can make a relationship to each other while respecting their own interests as well as universal interests.
Thank you so much. Professor Mohammed.
Yes.
Yes, please. Just your maybe your concluding remarks on the issue of multilateralism, whether you are in favor of it, first of all, but then also the way forward to say, especially for me, you touched on the very important issue of wealth and income distribution, and also the what I would call the misuse of resources, really. But going forward, how do we ensure prudent use of resources, but also in view of multilateralism, whether you promote that and maybe solutions into the future?
Well, it depends on what we mean by multilateralism, of course, because what we see in the West is usually multilateralism, where Western powers dictate terms often to the rest of the world. They destroy Libya, they help their regional proxies destroy Yemen, they destroyed much of Syria by supporting extremist groups through Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the Israelis, among others. So that is one form of multilateralism. And one form of unilateralism is when the Iranians went into Iraq and Syria at the behest of the governments there to help them push back ISIS and Al Qaeda. So, whether, one is multilateralism and one is unilateralism. But I think the most effective means is for us to think of ways to create a multilateral network in the global south where countries of significance, political significance, that have weight, that carry weight, can come together and to push the interests of the global south forward through cooperation. Their coordination can help lead other countries in the global south to move in the same direction, and they could use that capability to put pressure on global hegemons and also to uh, have greater influence over the decision-making process, for example, as I said earlier, in countries like China. So I do believe in both multilateralism and unilateralism, but when it comes from the West, whether it is multilateral or unilateral, it's usually to our detriment.
Thank you so much for those insightful comments. Professor Yolanda Spies.
Apologies. I want to reiterate what I said about Africa's approach. Africa has a history of at least trying to speak with one voice, of collectivity in its decision making, of multilateralism. We should draw on that strength to make the most of the opportunities that are available in this massive crisis. Because whoever else becomes involved in Africa, I don't care who they are in Africa for their own interest. We should not be naive about that. So we should be strategic about the multilateralism that we engage with. The world is entering an incredibly insecure era where there is no clear global hegemon, no clear superpower or leader that can dictate to any of these global institutions. And therefore, we need to find our voice and we have to speak from one agenda. And if we do that, we have agency.
Thank you so much. Professor Olontowa, please, your wrap-up comments.
Thank you very much. Like I said earlier on, it provides us the current challenges provide opportunity to rethink the philosophy, the ideology, the overarching ideology of international and global cooperation. And to me, it has to be centered or anchored around shared humanity. I know it's not that easy, but that is the only sustainable way to do. And there's a point that I supposed to mention earlier on about the role of non-state actors, like the private sector, like the civil society organization, like maybe an emergency of a new internationality of workers' solidarity and cooperation. Because you see that from 1945, I mean, increasingly, the voices of workers have been muted because the globalists, they just privilege the profit maximization of owners of capital at the expense of workers. So I would think that there's a need to create more consciousness among the underclass, among the workers of the world. I mean, there was a time workers of the world unite under Marxism. So I would think that there's a need for more involvement of non-state actors. And we see that during the first month of the pandemic, that private sector organizations donated money to government through various funds to help pushing the effect of COVID-19. So I would think that there's a need for more role for non-state actors in advocating for a better global community. BRICS, I was going to mention BRICS, but Brazil is under a kind of Trump in Latin America, Southern America. But then BRICS could have provided an alternative to what we have before. But then when you say that China need to be redefined, the value that China hold, Russia, the value that they hold, as well as India. So non-state actors, South-South cooperation based on shared identity and understanding, and then a louder voice for the structuring of multilateralism to advance shared humanity rather than profit maximization and domination. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Oloruntova. Professor Isike, your institution is hosting this, and we'll give you the honor of wrapping up the discussion. Your comment.
I promise I won't be a pastor. I would just be very brief. I would end with the with a quote from Robert Kearns' book, After Hegemony, where he wrote that the dominance of a single great power can contribute to order in world politics in particular circumstances, but that it is not a sufficient condition, and there's little reason to believe that it is, necessary. So what that means is that, you know, if we experience a decline in the power of a world hegemon, and we see less unilateral actions or from such a hegemon, it does not necessarily imply that the world is going to be unstable. In other words, that multilateralism is a good way to go, and this is why I like the the starting statement that Yolanda started with. This afternoon, she said, multilateralism is the democracy of international relations. But I agree with the statement, but my caveat would be that, for democracy to be meaningful, the element of participation of all its constituents must be, taken seriously. There is no way we can have a democracy when only a part of the elements of that democracy are the active participants. In other words, participation should be taken seriously. In this way, the views of everyone should matter. Equality of stakeholders should be a value to uphold, and in that way, the contributions that each of them can make would enhance the quality of such a democracy. So I would like to end with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Isiki, and thank you so much, everyone, all the participants. We wish this could have been a physical seminar where we meet in one room and we engage with one another and exchange business cards. But I think we have each other's email addresses. We can foster our networks and collaboration through those contacts. I think there's a lot that we can do together to influence, as academics, of course, to influence discourses and narratives over these issues, but also to meaningfully contribute to the challenges that the world is facing as we are living in unprecedented times and challenging times. Thank you so much for your contributions. On my own behalf, and of course, on behalf of the Faculty of Humanities, the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, and also the Head of Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria, I would like to thank you so much for your participation, and let's continue our discussion online, but off Zoom. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye,
you.
colleagues.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you
Bye,
so
everyone.
much.
Bye.
Bye,
Very
everyone.
much.